There is a lot to talk about with Richard Wagner, far too much for a relatively brief lobby lecture. So I'm going to not give you a lot of background about his life. I'm going to, in fact, just say that between the years 1849 and 1862, he was in exile for political reasons primarily. And he had enjoyed a couple of successes in the city of Dresden with particularly the opera Rienzi. But he turned his back on that style of writing, and although Rienzi remained a very popular work throughout the duration of the 19th century, he sort of disowned it. And his earliest successes, therefore, that are part of the Wagnerian canon are The Flying Dutchman, Lohengrin, Tannhäuser, and I think that's it. We don't count Meistersinger because it's later. Now, the reason he was exiled, as I said, had a lot to do with politics, but all of you will have remembered the events of 1848, and they were pretty fracturing. I'm not saying that you were there, neither was I, but it was pretty fracturing time in Europe, and it really wasn't a revolution of 1848, it was the sort of eruption of a bunch of simmering revolutions, and Wagner was a little bit of a political hothead, so some of his colleagues, some of his associates in the political arena were executed. So it was pretty serious for him to get out of town. And so with the help of a number of people, including Franz Liszt, he moved first of all to Zurich with his first wife, and then for various reasons that are more personal, he spent some time in Paris and in Venice. And it's here that we begin to see the work that we're going to look at tonight come to fruition. In 1848, Wagner had written a libretto for what was to be his pet project, which is a setting of the medieval tale of Siegfried's death. Ultimately, that will be part of the Ring of the Nibelungen, but the problem was Wagner looked at it and thought, it's not enough, I have to go back further and then I have to go forward. And so he ended up creating a libretto himself. That's one of the things Wagner will insist on, that the person who is creating the music for a dramatic piece also write the words. And it was based on a medieval epic poem entitled Nibelungenlied, or Nibelung Song. So this is really the sort of germ of what he's going to do. But before we look at the work, before we look at the music, I want to talk a little bit about the other great events that took place in Wagner's creative life during this time of exile, because they have to do with polemical writings. Of course, we know about some of the political ones, but we're going to focus on music and drama, opera and art, opera and revolution. And Wagner gave voice and words to his newly emerging philosophy. And he immediately decided he was not going to write operas anymore. So from now on, when you refer to the work that you're going to see tonight, you have to characterize it as a music drama, because that's Wagner's term for it. And yes, this is sort of splitting hairs of terminology, but there were many things in the Italian operatic style, which had become this sort of basic textbook for composition of opera, that he was opposed to. And the first one has to do with structure. The idea when you go to an Italian opera, you've seen Rossini, you've seen Bellini, and early Verdi. What you see is a succession of solo arias, each of which has its own internal structure. It builds up to a climactic passage. Usually there's a high note, and then everybody claps. Then we resume our attention, and often there's passages of what's called recitative, where the singing most closely resembles the rhythmic patterns of speech. Then we get an idea of what the plot is going, how the plot is going to move forward, and then there's another aria with its own internal structure and its own climactic moment and more applause. So first of all, Wagner felt that even without the applause, the drama is lurching from event to event, where it should flow much more naturally and much more freely. Also, he felt that the integrity of the story was being disrespected by pauses for applause. Now, I'm pretty sure you'll applaud after a certain number that begins Act 3 of this one. Okay? And you certainly have my blessing if you want to go ahead and do that. However, Wagner wanted to create a continuous, what he called continuous melody, and what some of his detractors have called endless melody. But the idea that the melody just keeps flowing and flowing and flowing, so it isn't reduced to a series of independent numbers. And there are several ways in which he accomplishes this. Do you want me to show you some of them? I'll do it quickly. The first thing I want to ask you is, do you understand what chromatic harmony is as opposed to diatonic harmony? Or would you like a little bit of a demonstration? Okay. This is a diatonic scale, and you all know it. You know it so well that if I do this, yes. So if I create chords made up of those notes, I have something called diatonic harmony. It's crystal clear and it's easily predictable. Everybody knows that song, right? Most of us learned a different word than we have to sing now. Now, chromatic harmony will take us through all the notes and chords available if I play this scale, which uses all of the notes in the octave. And some of you are as old as I am, or almost, and so you remember when we used film instead of digital cameras. Remember it was called Kodachrome? That's a chromatic scale coming from the Greek word for color. And that adds lots more colors. It's sort of like when you're in elementary school and you have the box, if you come from the working class, you have a box of 12 crayons, and some other kid from the uplands has a box of 60 crayons, and you're really jealous because they have access to so many colors that don't actually exist in nature anyway. But we have now access to many, many more chords. And we can mix them up in a way that does not allow the listener to follow the harmonic line as easily. So that's one of the devices Wagner uses a great deal to create a sense of the music flowing onward and onward and onward. Another one is one of my favorites, the deceptive cadence. So that's where we expect to hear a sequence of chords like with God Save the King, and then we change the harmonic direction like this. So all of these surprise cadences will prevent a sort of definitive full stop, except at only a few moments in the whole piece. And even the famous numbers from this work that you may have heard in a concert have had to be altered by an orchestrator in order to create that ending. Otherwise, it just keeps going and going and going like the ever-ready bunny. So that's one of the ways in which Wagner departs from the Italian prototype. Another one is basically the subject matter. During a time when his great colleague Giuseppe Verdi was taking for his plots contemporary plays, some of which were quite topical, some of which were quite controversial, Wagner was turning to ancient mythology and ancient history. The Nibelungenlied, after all, is a medieval source. And he felt also that the subject matter should be dealing with very, very elevated and didactic tones. Now, Wagner as a human being was anything like was nothing like as noble as the characters that he presented on stage. A man being redeemed through the platonic love of a virtuous woman is not something he experienced in real life. And he was two things that will remind us of Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's librettist. He was a libertine, he was an egoist, he was a megalomaniac. He liked to run up debts everywhere, and then when he finally got some money, he'd buy himself an ermine jacket, because, you know, I deserve it. So he sometimes did have to leave town under darkness of night to escape creditors. He also, of course, had an almost insatiable appetite for the ladies, particularly seeming to like ladies who were already engaged or married to somebody else. So his life was far from uneventful and far from virtuous. But that's what he wanted to present on the operatic stage. He also created a term, or coined a term, Gesamtkunstwerk, which means complete artwork. The Germans are really good at just stringing words together to make ever longer words. I want to introduce you to one of our greatest first violinists, Müge Butcheron. And where we look for this in Wagner. We look for the idea of him writing the libretto, him writing the music, him designing the set, him designing the opera house, actually, where the whole ring was first presented. And of course, he felt that one artist should be responsible for all aspects of a work. And of course, it was going to be the great the great Wagner, who was responsible. His wife put it even more far-reachingly, even more idealistically, and even more impractically when she said, one day in the future, people will look back in bewilderment at this period in history where there were separate arts like painting, architecture, music, poetry. She envisioned that her husband, this was his second wife, she was the daughter of Liszt, and she dumped her husband and children to be with Wagner, and her husband still championed Wagner's music. That's how charismatic he was. Anyway, his wife Cosima said that he will be responsible for fusing together all the arts into one great Gesamtkunstwerk. It didn't work out that way, but he made a pretty good shot at it. So also, one of the things that annoyed Wagner a little bit is that we could see the orchestra in opera houses. Now, what this means is that he felt that the orchestra provided us with what we might call the inner drama of the characters. Anybody who has studied acting will know the term subtext. And in opera, in music drama, and for that matter in song, the music has provided us with the subtext. And Wagner felt that the music had to be an equal partner in the telling of the story with the words. So he felt that since it represented the inner drama, that what the character was thinking rather than what the character was saying, it was sort of disrupting and distracting to see the orchestra. And the orchestra, he also felt, being an equal partner, should have access to as many orchestral colors as possible. So the Wagner orchestra is very large. A bit more about that later. But the inner drama represents the interior thoughts of the character, and the outer drama represents what's being spoken. I think that's all that I wanted to say at this time, because we're going to move now to one of the most historically important and much discussed aspects of Wagner's new art, and this is the creation of the leitmotif, or the leading motive. So before I actually begin explaining this, I'm also going to talk about the plot a little bit. How many of you have read the plot synopsis? Oh, good. But I'm going to maybe fill it in a little bit, connecting with some of the music. I mentioned that we can see the orchestra. You can see the orchestra at the Royal, you can see the orchestra at the Met, but there's one opera house that was constructed according to Wagner's own specifications and financed by his great savior and patron, King Ludwig II of Bavaria. That opera house is in the South German city of Bayreuth, and it has the orchestra seated in tiers underneath the stage. I meant tiers, like levels. This guy's playing a bass trumpet in this, Scott McInnes. They may be in tiers. I know it's a long play and quite difficult, but that means we can't see them. They can see the conductor. We can see maybe the top of the conductor's head. Then the singers can see the conductor. It is said that also helps Wagner create a massive orchestra that doesn't drown the singers out. But we must have Wagnerian voices, and they have to be able to penetrate through a large wall of sound, because the orchestra will play much more than what we can think of as an accompaniment. Okay, I'm going to just show you that too. Here's what is a typical accompaniment figure that comes from an opera that everybody knows, and probably all of you have heard this tune. So that's all the orchestra is doing. The tenor on stage is doing this. Oops, wrong note. So that's a very extreme example of Verdi creating actually a sense of this character must be quite superficial, and he is. And so he has this melody that's easily memorable. Everybody hums it all over the world, and an accompaniment that does nothing but be subservient to the tune. So Wagner avoids that. And so the orchestra will have independent melodies, sometimes more than one being heard at the same time, of incredible variety of orchestral color. So you're going to hear that tonight. It's just a little bit more pastel than oil, perhaps. But the performance of the orchestra on Monday was absolutely superlative, so I know you can look forward to that. Now, I mentioned leitmotif. A motive is a fragment of melody. And it serves an abundance of purposes. Here's a really famous motive that you've all heard. And probably you've also heard what comes next. and then many, many fewer people than have heard what comes after that and heard the whole piece. So that is not really a melody, it turns itself into a melody. And the Wagner leitmotif, a leading motive is what it means, is meant to be associated with a character, with a place, with a thought, a state of mind, and a feeling, an emotion. And he weaves them throughout the fabric and the texture and the structure of the 3-act work that you're going to see tonight. And that becomes his sort of standard. Other composers have used leading motive as well, including Verdi, but to nothing like the same extreme. And that's why it's kind of handy to at least hear a few of them. And I know you will all know some, but some of them may be not quite so familiar. It's not as obvious as you'd think which motives belong to which characters. Now I'm going to stand up and say one more thing. There is no getting around this, but the work is a tetralogy. That means Die Walküre is one of 4 evenings in the opera house. It begins with a prelude called Das Rheingold. Did anybody see the POV production of Das Rheingold a number of years ago? It was really good, wasn't it? And because it's only a prelude and lasts a mere 2 3/4 hours long, it's given without an intermission. Now, the other ones are longer than that, but they aren't 5 hours long, therefore. And in the case of Walküre, you get 2 half-hour intermissions. Now, a show of hands can tell me if my suspicion is right. Especially the ladies may wish that we always had half-hour intermissions because of the inadequacy of our facilities. Because you always see the lines, "Can I share a little story with you?" and the people on the bus. It's like that everywhere. I was waiting in line for the men's room in a Broadway theater in New York, and someone brushed against me and said, "Oh, pardon me." And I turned around, it was Calvin Klein. I could have said, "Look, I've got your name on the back of your shirt." Anyway, so the leading motives are not so easy to follow, but some of them and some of the references to character come from Das Rheingold. There'll be a reference to Erde, the goddess of the earth. She is the mother of the Walküres. The Walküres are warrior goddesses who scour battlefields, picking up the dead bodies of slain soldiers who distinguish themselves bravely in battle. Their father is Wotan, the leading god and the hero of Rheingold, or sort of the hero of Walküre as well. But Erde doesn't appear in this, except in pantomime, but she is mentioned. Alberich is mentioned as well. He's the evil little gnome that possesses the gold. And it's because of what happens with the gold through Alberich and through the giants Fasolt and Fafner. Maybe that's enough names that aren't going to be in tonight for now. We will learn about why everything is in turmoil, why everything is in flux, why everything is unsettled. And I want to say one other thing to you. You're going to be watching this and you're going to be thinking, "Oh my God, the patriarchy was alive and well back in the 19th century," and it is. But in your keynotes that you can get scattered around, there's an article by Alex Chen, which basically lets you know, in uncertain terms, that the heroine of the ring is Brunhilde, the head Walküre. She does what nobody else would dare do. She destroys the world so that it can be brought back in a more virtuous stage. But you have to wait until the end of Götterdämmerung for that. Anyway, the 3rd evening in the theater is Siegfried, the plot that gave Wagner the initial idea, and then finally the last one, Twilight of the Gods. So shall I show you some of these leitmotifs? Okay, it's a dark and stormy night, quite literally it is, and we're in the forest, and a young man named Siegmund has been left unarmed and therefore unprotected in a struggle against a barbarian gang. And he finds his way to a house, a hut in the forest, and it's the law of the forest that the person who owns the house must give aid, rest, food to a stranger. And only the wife of the hut is home. Her name is Sieglinde. Sieglinde and Siegmund are also children of Wotan. He fathered them with a mortal woman. So they are twins. They were separated at birth, but they kind of recognize something similar in each other. They're twins, in other words. And it turns out through a series of little revelations that they realize that they are soulmates because they have the same parents. But they also fall in love. So you just have to accept that. The English critics of the 1870s were completely unable to accept that. So we meet them. Now Sieglinde is married, and she was forced into a very unhappy marriage with an unpleasant barbarian named Hunding, Hunding is the leader of the tribe that just almost killed Siegmund. So he arrives home, realizes something is afoot, and so we know trouble is going to be brewing. So we have that trio of people, okay? So I'm going to show you a few leitmotifs from this act. This is the first act. So here is the leitmotif for Hunding. In and of itself, it doesn't appear as importantly as some of the others, but it has a very revelatory, makes a very revelatory appearance in Act 2. What should I play it? I'm going to play it again. It reminds me of this. It sounds like a kind of Darth Vader character. And so as I said, that will come back. Now, there is also motives that represent Siegmund and Sieglinde, but I think more famously, I want to play you a motive that represents their love for each other, because you hear this a lot throughout Die Walküre. It's in two parts. It's a beautiful cello solo, by the way. And then this is the second part. So that literally is the love motive, and it will appear in an aria. Now, really, I'm not supposed to say aria. It's not really an aria, but sometimes sopranos who want to sing it will get somebody to create an aria out of it just by adding a new ending. And this is where Sieglinde is pouring her heart out to Siegmund, saying, you are the spring. He's told her that he's woe, he's sadness, he's turmoil. But she says, no, you're the spring. And she has those two melodies formed together to make this aria. Du bist der Lenz. There's all sorts of orchestra doing stuff. It sounds way better than it does with just piano, I'm sorry. But that combines the two motives, or the two fragments of motive that give us the love motive. And it's sung, you'll hear it a great deal. You'll also hear the next one I'm going to play. Siegmund knows that his father has put a sword, he's embedded a sword in a tree. And many, many people have tried to extricate the sword from the tree, and they haven't been able to. And of course, the tree is located right next to the hut where Sieglinde and Hunding live. Even with so serious-minded a composer as Wagner, you have to remember this is opera, it's not documentary. So, of course, Siegmund is able to extricate it, and we hear the sword motive whenever he thinks about it, and in great triumph when he actually manages to pull that sword out. And we know he's going to need it, because Hunding has said, yep, the law of the forest compels me to be a host to you tonight, but we're going to fight tomorrow, and I'm going to kill you. And that's really all it is. I'll have another shot at it. All it is C major. But of course, what is purer and more virtuous than C major? And so this indicates that Siegmund is a virtuous man. Now, that's all I'll give you from Act 1. And it concludes with a kind of rapturous feeling of love between Siegmund and Sieglinde. And yes, what do they say today? They hook up. So you can think about that during the first half-hour intermission while you're in line. Now, in the second act, we meet our first Walküre. And I often think of this when I think of the Walküres. And you remember that in the parlor game we used to play, is seeing if you could remember all 7 of the dwarves. Try this one out without looking at your program. Now, Brunhilde is the head Walküre. She's the most beloved of her father, so of course we always remember her. But the other ones are Gerhilde, Ortlinde, Waltraute, Schwertleite, Helmwege, Sigruna, Grimgerde und Rossweiße. And they sort of like, well, I was reading them. I didn't do that from memory. And together they are the warrior goddesses who were formed from the union of Wotan and Erde. And they have the most famous motive of all, and I'm just going to play it for you now, get it over with. Everybody's heard that, right? You love the smell of napalm in the morning, or kill the rabbit. Everybody's familiar with it from some point in popular culture. But this is Wotan summoning his favorite daughter because he knows about the fight. Wotan is presented always with a spear and with an eye patch. I'll explain the spear later, but the eye patch is because when he got the ability, when he was given the ability to see everything, no matter where he was, he had to give up one of his eyes, so he had less immediate sight. And so he summons Brunhilde, and she comes on with the Valkyrie's cry, Hoya to ho. So we have this again. And she sings. And then lots of Hoya to hos in a row. So that's not easy to do, but from now on, just to do this for fun with your friends and family, when you greet them at Christmas time, say, Hoya to ho! You'll make new friends everywhere you go. Now here's where Hunding's tune comes back to haunt us a little bit. Wotan summons his daughter and asks her to ensure, well, he doesn't ask the warrior daughters, he tells them, he tells her to ensure that his son Siegmund wins this fight. But Fricka knows that that's what he wants, and she's approaching with her, I think she has sheep that carry her, goats that carry her around. And Brunhilde says Fricka's on her way. And who is Fricka? She is Wotan's wife. She does come across as being a bit of a scold, but imagine, he's got these 8 warrior daughters that he sired with Erda. He's got 2 mortal children that he sired with a mortal woman. And here we have Christy Myers, our associate concertmaster. And so her province as a goddess, is domestic felicity. In other words, marriage. She's the goddess of marriage, and her own husband can't be controlled. So she says, no. First of all, this happened. We will hear the orchestra warming up, but we will persevere like Wagnerian singers. First of all, Hunding, however odious and barbarous he might be, is the lawful husband of Sieglinde. The other thing is, your children that you're so proud of and that you love so much just committed adultery. Not only adultery, but incestuous adultery. And surely you're not going to reward something like that. And so every now and again, I guess, Wotan, who doesn't back down in front of anybody, has to back down in front of Fricka. And so he orders Brunhilde now to ensure that Hunding wins the fight, which puts her in a very awkward position because, of course, she knows that this is our bass trombone player, Bob Fraser, but also she knows that in his heart of hearts, he wants his beloved son to win. So off she goes, feeling pretty conflicted about the whole thing. Next one. So onto the stage, as Siegmund and Sieglinde are basically celebrating their love and awaiting the arrival of Hunding. We're going to have a fight. We hear 2 motives that accompany Brunhilde in her entrance that we will hear plenty of. Well, the first one even more than the second. The first little tiny motive I'm going to play for you is called Fate. I've got to find the right notes. And this one is Death. And then Fate again. And Brunhilde is come face to face with an emotion she's never experienced before. She's never experienced compassion and empathy for a human being because she's not a human being. And she begins to feel it for Siegmund. And she feels in her heart of hearts that she must cause him to win. You'll see this in the conversation they have. She doesn't feel she's disobeying her father. She feels she's doing what her father really wants. And so what happens? And yes, we must ask ourselves, why didn't you just take care of it in the first place, Wotan? Wotan, I guess, reads her heart of hearts. He comes to where the fight is, intervenes. He smashes that special sword so that Siegmund is not armed and is killed by Hunding. And then he goes, well, in this production, he goes behind Hunding's back and breaks his neck. So he kills both of them anyway. And there they are. And Sieglinde is absolutely heartbroken. And wants to die too, but Brunhilde takes her away, and she goes running towards her sisters to try to escape her father's wrath and inevitable punishment, but also to protect Sieglinde. And she sings the following leitmotif, which will be the last one we hear sung with words, and I'll play it for you now. Does anybody else have like 17 pairs of reading glasses strewn around everywhere? Okay, to the accompaniment of the horns, she sings this motive as she announces to Sieglinde, you can't kill yourself, girl. You are carrying a child who is going to be a hero. And she has this music. And that is the Siegfried motive. So we learn then, and we will be reminded, Wagner is not absolutely light-handed about this, we will be reminded that in fact the baby that Sieglinde is carrying is Siegfried. And he's fated to be a very important player. Now, once Sieglinde realizes this, she sings what is sometimes called a redemption motive, keeping in mind that the redemption of a flawed man by a virtuous woman is a common theme encountered in Wagner. This theme only appears again once, and that's at the end of Götterdämmerung, when the whole thing is over. Oh, I played the wrong note, that's horrible. Here we go again. There's a lot of those tremolos in the orchestra that sound divine when the strings are doing them and horrific when the piano is. So I apologize. But that is a wonderful motive, and it's sung beautifully by our Sieglinde. Now we move towards what is probably the most moving part of the whole drama, and that's when Wotan has to say goodbye to Brunhilde. And the important thing to remember is he loves her dearly, but she's disobeyed him. And because of his position as a god, he has to go with what he knows to be the proper way to behave. He can't follow his heart and forgive her. And essentially what happens at the end is as follows. Brunhilde begs her father, and she reminds him of all the wonderful times they've had. She begs her father to at least make sure that she is rescued by someone worthy of her. He says, I'm going to take away your godhead. That means she will be immortal. Mortal, not immortal, mortal. And then I'm going to put you to sleep, not in our modern sense. I'm going to put you into a slumber. Think Ripley in Alien. And then the first man who comes and wakes you up can keep you. And she says, well, at least make sure he's worthy of me. And so she proposes something, and ultimately he relents and accepts. And this is what happens. One of our bassoon players, Ann Power, she says, at least circle me with fire so that only a brave hero can come and rescue me. So he agrees to do that. So yes, this is where Johnny Cash got the idea of Ring of Fire. He agrees that he will encircle the sleeping Brunhilde with a ring of fire, and then he gets the last line in, which I'll tell you in a few motives. So when finally he relents, we have this motive, which is all about Wotan's love for his daughter. So that is lyrical and beautiful and wonderful. And then we move into the scene where he actually does put her to sleep. And we hear two motives associated with sleep. One is simply called the slumber motive. It does sound comforting, doesn't it? And this is where he says goodbye to those precious eyes that I loved so much. Then we have what's called the magic sleep, which is, of course, he puts her into a sleep which can only be interrupted when she is awoken by a hero. Now, a motive you're going to hear plenty earlier in Die Walküre than this is the one associated with Wotan's spear. He carries it around a lot, and this is explained too, because he has inscribed on it the details of all the contracts he's made. And many of them, because they were fueled by greed and a lust for power, are not ethical. They're not really respectable. So he has himself caused the turbulence and the flux and the instability of all the gods. And this is the spear motive. And he's using it to summon Loge, the god of fire, to create the fire that goes around Brunhilde. So Loge's motive is just basically what you'd expect it to be for a spirit we don't see who makes fire. And so on he comes to make the fire, and not only do we have Loge's motive, we have a magic fire motive. And you'll hear that virtually all the way till the end. But the last thing Wotan says, he addresses the tip of his spear and says, "No man who fears the tip of my spear will ever penetrate that ring of fire." And what is the motive he sings it to? The Siegfried motive. So just in case we didn't put two and two together earlier, he's telling us Siegfried will be the one that wins Brunhilde. So that is quite a number of motives that I just played for you. I hope some of them will resonate. I'm assuming some of them did already. That last Siegfried motive was so well known 100 years ago, 90 odd years ago, when the first motion picture to win Best Picture was Wings, that was set in the First World War. And in the score that accompanied it, it was a silent movie, whenever a German plane was flying towards an American one, they played the Siegfried motive. I guess they wanted us to think, oh, those Germans, but Siegfried is a hero. So anyway, all of that to say, please enjoy your evening with the book. Please don't think it's going to be boring. It's not boring or tedious. You don't even notice the hours going along. It's incredibly exciting, and I know you're going to love it. Thank you very much for coming to spend your time with me, and enjoy the show. Thank you.